Hello.
Hello.
So we are going to start doing little mutings of people since we have many, many people. So let me see if I can figure out a way to do that.
Is it Tasha? Did I see Tasha? No. Oh.
All right. Hello. We're going to allow a little time for everyone to get on board. And we've muted all of you just so that you don't hear tons and tons of. We're going to keep remuting as we go along. Hi, Katie. Hi, everyone. So we have, I think, close to 200 people that will be coming. So we're going to keep muting and unmuting you all. And if you have the capacity to, just keep muting yourselves, and we'll give you the capacity to unmute yourself as you come in. And we've actually never tried doing Zoom meeting for a group this large, so we're really excited to try it out. And completely, thrilled and happy that we're able to. So I'm going to spend a couple moments remuting people as they come in, which will work or not work. Katie, I think you have that capacity to keep muting. Do you see that in the manage participants window? And you're one of our admins now. And so you can click on manage participants, and then in the right-hand nav bar, you can see that there's a mute all. Mm-hmm. Do you have that?
Yeah, let's
okay, so you can keep also muting people. And so we're just going to take a couple of minutes to let people log in, and you'll start seeing lots and lots of little faces showing up. Hi, Catherine. So I'm going to take a moment as we're logging in and introduce to you our wonderful team. We have Catherine, who is waving at you, and she's our online course greenskeeper. And you might, if you want to say a couple words of greeting, you can.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm really excited about today's webinar, and many of you who are in YMNB know that I just sort of transitioned into this role of course greenskeeper. So we're having a lot of fun, and I'm really looking forward to continuing to work with all of you and maybe getting to work with some new folks who might be joining us after this webinar. Thanks, both.
Thanks. And Katie, I want to introduce Katie to you as well. Hi, Charlotte. So, Katie, do you want to say a couple words?
Yes.
I'll do the muting for you.
Okay.
Oh, now you have to sorry, I just muted you by mistake.
Yes, and just to let you know, I think you have the ability to mute all. I don't see it on my end. I think as the administrator, yeah. But hi, everyone. My name is Katie. I'm the administrative assistant and kind of organizational guru for both. So I will be working with her. I'm fairly new to the team, just started a couple weeks ago. So very nice to meet you all and look forward to the meeting.
Very cool. And then we have Charlotte too, who's our research coordinator. I can see you, Charlotte. So just a couple things about how Zoom works. I'll keep hitting mute all. So we are recording this webinar, and probably if you're not in the online course already, we'll send you an audio recording. We just have to figure out the legalities of having lots of pictures of people. So one thing I would say is that if you don't want your image to appear, and this will not be shared with anyone who isn't here, but you can, at the lower left-hand corner of the little Zoom box, you can stop video just by clicking on the little video camera if you like. And you can also mute and unmute yourself. And I'll share a funny story as we're heading on, but I talked to the Zoom people. We actually thought we would get about 20 people, and we had close to 300 replies for this webinar. So we scrambled around yesterday, and when I was talking with the Zoom people, they insisted we should go to the webinar option so that nobody would have controls over when and how they were muted. And that seemed a little less interactive to us. So after going back and forth, we decided to try this first one with the mute button available to each of you. And so it just takes a little practice with Zoom in terms of figuring out how to get yourself in there. So we are recording now, and I'm going to be sharing the screen with you and kind of going through a presentation and some practice. And then we really want to make it totally interactive in places. So we'll do some practice together, and then we'll have the capacity to speak to each other and ask questions through chat, which I really love. I actually this week attended a webinar where I didn't have any controls at all. It was fun. It just felt less interactive than we want to be. I think some of these discussions are really important to see if we can figure out ways to have an interchange. So if you'll bear with us, as we're a little larger than we thought we would be. So one thing I wanted to do, which I thought would be fun, is if you go to the bottom of your screen and you click on chat, I see that Katie emailed us, and you can email questions in through that chat window. And Katie and Catherine are going to be looking at that chat window, as will I. So here and there, we'll be able to take questions. But for now, it would be fun to test it out by saying your name and where you're zooming in from today. So feel free to try out that chat version. Again, it's at the bottom of your Zoom little box. You can hit chat, which is third, I believe, from the right. And I see Justine from Portugal, Charlotte from Wellesley, Mary Ann from Denver, Luarca, Asturias. Wow, those are going by fast. Atlanta, Tulsa, New Hampshire, Arkansas, Framingham, Victoria, British Columbia, upstate New York, Greenbelt, Maryland, the Wakefield in the UK. Hi, David. Philadelphia, Candace. These are going awfully fast. So yeah, just keep chatting in. Hi, Enrico. Hi, Tasha. Enrico's from Colorado, but really from Italy. He's doing some work with us, as is Tasha. I see Lucy from Vancouver, Lynn from Chicago. We're typing in through the chat window, and they're coming in kind of fast here. I'm going to also hit our mute all button, if I can get that one back. Hard to hit that button for now. So I'm going to close my chat window, and feel free to keep entering where you're from. Oops. And we're going to get started in just a moment here. What I would say too is just to let you know once more, if you would keep yourself muted most of the time, so we don't have any interesting bathroom sounds or pets barking or things like that. We know sometimes you need to take a little break. That mute button is the lower left-hand side. We're also video recording, and the most that you'll see in this little period of time is your face in a tiny little square. You may not even, because we have many, many people. So you can change that by just clicking through the stop video. When we get to Q&A, if we can, we'll have you ask your question in person, and that will bring you up on the screen. So you'll be able to mute that if you like. So one more, let me see if I can, I'm going to mute all one more time. And then I would just say, just keep muting yourself as you're coming in so that we don't have those beeping sounds. I think we still have about 140 or so more people that will be zooming in. And then Katie, I think you might be an admin, so you could try out clicking Manage Participants at the bottom, and you may get an option to mute all. If not, I'll keep doing that. So I'd love to start up, and what I'll do is screen share with you. We're going to go through a little bit of a PowerPoint, and we'll talk a little bit about what is the purpose of this webinar. Is it a webinar? What is it? The term webinar implies question and answer. And just to give you a little bit of background, in our newest online course, we've been doing these once a month or once every few weeks, and started to realize that we're starting to offer new information quite a lot of the time. And it's beginning to dovetail away from just straight up Q&A. And when that happened, it was sort of exciting to me. And I thought, well, let's see if anybody else is wanting to share information about embodiment, about the lived experience of being in a body, of some of the things that get in our way in real life. So this is part of our current experiment. And one thing for you to know is that we don't really, our way or is to not wait till we have everything right before we experiment, because that just implies a kind of constant kind of perfecting of things. So our preference is to really ensure that we're experimenting, we're creative, we're coming up with new forms, and we might continue to keep changing that as time goes on. Once I screen share, I think it's a little harder to mute all. So as I'm hearing beeps, I'll just remind you guys if you're logging in. Oh. Does everyone hear those beeps? You do, okay. So I think the idea of logging on with a mute button doesn't always happen, and we may decide to go to webinar, but I love the interactiveness. In a webinar, you're not going to see each other and you won't really see where you're from. So let's get started. I'm going to screen share with you, and we'll screen share from our resilience and social justice element here. And I'm going to start a little bit of a slideshow and kind of explain where we're going as we go through. I'm going to move around this little part here so that we have some control over what you're seeing. And then this one here, maybe we'll put that there at the bottom. And so this is what we're considering our connective tissue of life series. So this idea that we have information about the body, about neuroscience, about mindfulness, about contemplative practice, but it's not always so easy to apply that information to our lives, to figure out how to not simply live better, but to live better with one another. So we use the analogy of connective tissue to really describe this concept of what is the substance, what are the practices that really link and tie together the information coming in from all these seemingly disparate fields like connective tissue research. What's the substance that links that to the lived experience of being human today, of being alive today? So that's our current engagement and experiment. And we're looking today at the model of stress reduction, the removal of stress, versus the concept of stress resilience, learning how to interface with stress. And you could think of it as having stress work with us rather than feeling like it's something that's debilitating or working against us. And in the context of that, we're also working with this concept of discomfort, disappointment, and then as we're calling it, dissing of all kinds. And what is happening then when we get into these periods of feeling outraged or uncomfortable or disappointed in things, and how that might be actually a really important element of contemplative practice. So that's the kind of background for where we're going. And let me see if it may be not possible for me to scroll as easily here. And in fact, give me one moment to make sure that we're getting through. I'm going to stop screen sharing for just a moment so that we can ensure that our screen, in fact, is not freezing up. So give me just a moment to do that. Okay, so I'm going to ask anyone just coming on now if you will kind of mute yourself and give us a moment here to pop into our slideshow. So I think what we're having is an issue of PowerPoint and slideshows. So in just a minute, we'll be able to get that one back online. But for the moment, I'd love for you, and we're going to do this again one more time. So this is actually a planned part of what we're doing, both living with the unexpected and then also figuring out what is a recent situation that you have been through in which you've been either disappointed or upset or feeling that sense of righteous indignation or outrage. What has that looked like for you? And so we'll come back online here. We will share the screen, see if that does it. And here we go. A little technological glitch. Here we go. So today's menu, we're going to be looking at individual well-being, but through the lens of our community. What are the practices that not only strengthen an individual, but also impact the strength of our community? And we'll be looking at the traditions of mindfulness, also neuroscience. We'll be looking a little bit at psychology. And if you're just popping online, go ahead and hit the mute button at your lower left-hand Zoom corner. We're looking also at contemplative practice, movement studies. So what does the body have to do with everything? And intersectionality, and that's a word that's often used with regard to race. So we'll be looking at how social structures actually reinforce suffering and reinforce inequality. And we'll be looking a little bit today at social justice, but also particularly social context. What's going on with some of these issues? So here we have the little fruit fly, and I want to kind of zoom out and widen the aperture a little bit of what we're looking at and include the concept of biodiversity. So it may seem like, well, we're supposed to be talking about stress resilience, how to become more resilient in the face of stress. So why are we talking about biodiversity? What could that possibly have to do with anything? And what biodiversity refers to is this concept of variability, of difference among living organisms, and not just human organisms, but organisms from all sources, terrestrial, marine, aquatic systems, and the complexes or larger systems in which they operate. And so to have this as a lens through which we're thinking about stress and our bodies and yoga and mindfulness and contemplative practice. It may not surprise many of you to learn that our biodiversity has greatly reduced since humans have appeared on the scene and is rapidly becoming reduced. So I think 99.9% of all species have become extinct. And we want to be thinking about, well, why is that important? It's because biodiversity itself is really intimately linked with our well-being, with what makes us well. I love the film Avatar, so we have one of the Na'vi here. Have to bring that in. And so to kind of define biodiversity a little bit more closely and how we actually relate to it, we can be thinking about what ways does it actually impact our well-being, so that doesn't sound like just a very general and kind of new age statement. So we have food. Biodiversity does definitely affect food resources and the diversity of food resources. And then even things like energy security, what natural resources are, to whom they are available. Any access to water and other materials. So we don't think about water simply as a resource, but as a material on its own. And then also thinking about our vulnerability to natural disasters. As our biodiversity decreases, we're also finding ourselves more and more prone to earthquakes and floods and fire and famine. And then also human health, the health of the human organism. But then also, and here's that tie-in to stress resilience and the way we relate to others. We're really looking at how biodiversity affects our freedom of choice, what we're able to choose for ourselves and what we accept as part of that lens of choice. Some helpful things to think about is that the United Nations has actually named the decade that we're in now, the tail end of, from 2011 to 2020, is the biodiversity decade. So really looking at how do we preserve biodiversity? How do we preserve the species that we live among and in? And we know that biodiversity is rapidly decreasing. Alongside that, the World Health Organization, also a very important international organization, has begun to put forth initiatives to reduce the spread of domestic violence on the body and being of others that we're close to. And has also, if you're just joining us now, if you would hit your mute button on the lower left, that would be helpful. But also depression initiatives. So initiatives to spread depression. By the year 2020, depression will be the #2 health problem on the planet. And in another 10 years, the #1 health problem. And so when we look at biodiversity decreasing, alongside domestic violence increasing and depression increasing, we can start to say, well, maybe these 3 elements are actually a lot more connected than we may have thought. So we'll take a moment, and I think before we look at biodiversity in a social context, just taking a moment to pause and kind of absorb. I'll stop the screen share for just a moment. And then I'll ask everyone who's just come on to kind of mute, hit the mute button so that you're muting yourself. I'm going to also, I'll keep hitting mute all. And so just taking a moment to sort of register this concept of biodiversity in your own body. Like, what's your relationship with diversity of experience, diversity of different ideas that are coming in from other people? And then if you are a yoga teacher, you might be thinking about what is your relationship to the diversity of ideas within yoga, within the world of yoga. Is there a tendency to feel, well, this is how it is. This is how we do things. This is how it should be. And so that's one of the ways that we sort of resist a sense of growing diversity. So let's pause and take a moment of reflection. And one of the ways that we do that is by checking in with our body. So it might be a nice opportunity to do a little mini embodiment minute. And so wherever you are in space, you might place your hands on your body, anywhere that you might want to feel into. And then just noticing our perceptual sort of body parts, the head, the eyes and visual cortex, our jaw. So all the organs of perception, are they strongly kind of accumulating knowledge? I know information tends to flow fast sometimes in the virtual setting. How do we feel seeing lots of people around us and kind of being exposed to all these different faces, places, and ideas? And then asking the question, am I in my body in this moment? And sometimes just asking that question can cause us to feel a little jolt of anxiety. We might not readily know the answer, but we make that inquiry together anyway. It's really kind of noticing over time the relationship we have with inhabiting the body we live in, our sense of physicality, and then maybe even what is the depth of my breath in this moment? Am I breathing? And what is the pace of my mind? So our thoughts flowing rapidly from one to the next. And then anything else you might want to notice or register. Any areas that feel tender or tight, or someone mentioned today in class the idea of congestion in certain areas of the body, or communication maybe not traveling from one area to another. And when you've noticed what there is to notice in the realm of the body, you might begin to slowly transition your eyes to open, or you can keep them closed, but maintaining that thread of connection with your innerness. And you might have noticed that even from the beginning of what we call this check-in to the end, there can be things that have been changing and shifting along the way. You might not be in the same body in this moment that we were 2 minutes ago. And this may seem like a strange thing to do, like this is not an intervention, it's not a series of poses, it's not a themed meditation like a self-compassion meditation. all we're doing is being present with the inner state of the body as it changes from one moment to the next. And that's going to be important later on if you've not been thinking about this idea of receiving internal information, which we could call interoception, the attention to momentary bodily sensation. It turns out to be incredibly important to the notion of resilience to stress, and also to the concept of diversity. So we're going to pop forward a little bit back into screen share. Let's see if we can get this to seamlessly toggle back and forth. And I think we'll start with this concept of biodiversity in social context. Let's see. Oh. Hang on one second while we get our current slide. And I think I'm going to plug in my little, yeah. All right, I'm going to unshare for just a second. I'm going to pause the share notion, and it may just be also, as I'm interocepting, my computer is finding itself to be very hot in this moment in time. So let's see if we can get that going. Okay, and we'll resume the screen share. Oh, and resume the slideshow. Here we go. So let's take a look at biodiversity in a social context. If you're just coming on board, please do mute yourself there. Let me see if I can get that. Yeah, we'll go mute all. And mute. There we go. And minimize. Okay, so looking at this concept of colonialism and the body, and it may be, I'm going to pop out here. I'm going to pause that share. Let's see. Definitely give me one moment to let our PowerPoint. I see. I see what's going on. The PowerPoint made a copy of itself while we were screen sharing. So here we go again. And we're just getting to know this very different world of lots of participants. So let's see. Will this be the time that we'll get our slideshow? There we go. So I want to show you, this is the Keeper of the Western Door powwow in Salamanca, New York. This is a reservation that I lived on, a Seneca reservation, from before I was born to the time that I was 2 years old. And the story of this reservation is a sad one, so a little forewarning here. I'm going to move you guys over to this side. But in 1959, President Kennedy had promised when he was elected to preserve the land. And then later decided, not long afterward, to build the Kinzua Dam through the property of the Seneca Reservation in Salamanca, New York. And in the process, they divided the Seneca into two different groups and gave them land elsewhere. So the people that were once your neighbors, living literally right next to you, might be in another state altogether. 600 Seneca were displaced. And not just their homes, but 10,000 acres of land were destroyed in order to build that dam, along with sacred sites and burial grounds, and also ancestral homes. So I'm thinking about ancestral burial grounds. In the process, they lost also a lot of plant spirits, multi-generational gardens, and plants aren't simply something that we dig up or build or plant or grow, but they actually do have spirits, are considered to be living sentient beings. And within 2 years of that move, half the Seneca elders died. And it is said that they died of broken hearts. There was a song written or sung, I think, by Johnny Cash called "As Long as the Grass Will Grow," that was inspired by the plight of the Seneca, and he actually spent time on the reservation. In addition, the Seneca, along with most other natives in this country, were prevented from practicing their bodily rituals, like the sun dance and other rituals. And so just really kind of looking at the difficulty of how we sort of work with land and space in our country. Let's see if we can move forward. We may have to stop share for just a moment, but yes. So I think so I'm going to take a moment just to have everyone sort of connect in with the body. I think what's happening here is that our PowerPoint is sort of making copies of itself as we go. So we'll sort of loop back and forth. So as we sort of feel what's happening with the concept of what it means to actually be part of, for some of us, a dominant culture that has approached resources in this way and land in this way, and what it means as a part of our social context and what that says about the body. So super important. Let's see if we can show our slideshow from current slide here. There we go. And also deny the capacity to practice rituals that connect with the body. So I want to talk not simply about this as an example of colonialism and its impact on ritual and on interconnectedness, but what the characteristics are of indigenous societies versus sort of dominant culture. And these indigenous societies are often matrilineal. It's not the same as women having power over, but it's a sense of equal and shared power. And this becomes very important in what we're talking about because we have this idea of different yet equal. And very often in our dominant culture, we want everyone to be the same in order to be equal. So again, this idea of biodiversity as being something that we can thrive on. The body is sacred and not something to be overly shaped or exploited as a resource. There's an interconnectedness between the individual, their culture, sort of ancestors aren't in the past but are very much present, all living beings, and the land itself, and then also what's considered spirit. And this is actually, these are the same qualities of the field that's emerging now through neuroscience called embodied cognition. Really is a kind of indigenous way of approaching the world. So our indigenous people were not just the first people in the country of America and also Europe and many other countries, but the first to embrace the principles of sort of lived embodiment. The idea that we are all connected, which has a lot of impact on resilience. In contrast, we have colonialism and this sort of dominant culture theme, which has the element of dividing in order to conquer. What's interesting in the world of yoga now is we have had this way of understanding human anatomy, the anatomy of the body, as being a sum of parts. We have like the bicep origin, which is sort of up here high, and then it inserts close to the elbow. So this idea of different muscle groups that we work, or origin and insertion, that kind of reductionism. What's very interesting is that in order to arrive at that, early anatomists actually had to sort of dissect bodies, having removed the connective tissue first before doing so. And that's when they saw this kind of idea of disparate parts that can be worked. Also in colonialism, often in dominant culture, we value reason over any other kind of knowledge or gnosis. And there's this incredible thirst for development, for mastery over nature, for forward movement. Often there's an intellectual privilege. There's a kind of one way of thinking about things, one way of doing things, and very hard to tolerate any kind of diversity of opinion or intellectual ideas. Even the idea that anatomy is not simply origin and insertion and different parts we study, but we are rather sheaths of tissue, entire areas that interconnect, is an idea that's ripening, but hasn't been allowed to really come to the surface. And we can start to think about colonialism, not just in relation to the people that are exploited, such as indigenous people in different countries, but also in relation to the way we relate to and understand our relationship with our own body. We can value form over function, and also really emphasizing the cult of the individual, both individual body parts and the individual I that gets valued over the collective. And this idea that we should all be like everyone else, and at the same time, we have to optimize the self and be the best that we can be and better than we can be. And if you open Instagram, you kind of see a lot of evidence of that everywhere. And it becomes very hard to sort of tease apart this double message. Each part is something to be optimized and to be made better. Each pose is something to be perfected. And it's not that Instagram itself or pictures of poses are not productive in any way or are not art, but there's a lot of granularity there. And can we realize and understand the impact that dominant culture has on the body? And just to kind of highlight and point out here as well, that when we look at sort of the idea that we have to be like everyone else, and at the same time we must optimize the sort of power of the self to really stand out, we have what's called a double bind, which is something that's not possible to achieve at the same time and can be a little crazy making. So starting to look at this concept of what social frameworks are in play as we consider this. What's affecting and impacting us? And then we'll just take a pause moment to kind of, I'll pause sharing and just kind of take a moment to reflect in the field of our bodies among one another again, and sort of noticing how easy it is to kind of experience ourselves as separate. And in many ways, when we look at these social frameworks, we think about the concept of either we are an oppressor or we're oppressed. We look for rules about equality. Equality means that resources are shared, or equality means that we're all the same. And then often in this kind of colonialism, we have one group that sort of holds the burden for another group. We also have this individuality, as we've said, this idea that I have to take care of myself. I need to protect my own interests. And then we have something I've heard about a lot recently in yoga, which is the concept that vulnerability looks always a certain way. If I want you to be vulnerable, it has to be the way I think vulnerability should happen. And then we often have this idea of like, I deserve X, or it's about I, or about me, or about mine, what I can get. I'm just taking a moment to sort of acknowledge that and to kind of feel its influence in our lives. And as we kind of go forward a little bit, we'll do some more screen share if we can. The system is not exhausting itself. And then the question becomes, how do we recognize the pervasive influence of our dominant culture when it's everywhere, and also at the same time when it's invisible, when it just seems really normal? And this becomes the backdrop through which we deal with disappointment and stress reduction, and the idea that we need to be sort of removing sources of stress. And so as we see here, we're sort of looking at this idea of it looks like a kitten or just a nice fluffy cat, and yet there's this big shadow behind it. It's everywhere. And I feel as though today we can see, even in the world of yoga and the world of contemplative traditions, this dominant culture ideology is sort of expressing itself, is sort of, these are the thoughts that are acceptable. This is how people are viewed. And we can never kind of expand outside the framework of which others see us. Or we begin to threaten others, the expression of new ideas or ideas that are outside whatever dominant group we're in. And I think this idea that yoga is union and yoga is about togetherness and unity is a conceptual idea with a lot of power, and yet the connective tissue with which we enact it also has to be looked at and understood and sort of as part of the backdrop through which we're experiencing things. For just a moment or two, I wanted to look at how these same concepts actually play themselves out within the context of neuroscience and the development of the brain. And so over the last 2 million years, the brain developed in many ways. And one of those ways was to grow an actual completely new part. And that new part is called the prefrontal cortex, which you see in this kind of forward red area. And this concept that the prefrontal cortex, this whole new area, was actually responsible in evolution for the idea of planning, for our ability to anticipate the consequences of actions, for social behavior, this idea that if I do this, that will happen, and even the idea of a tribe. And if you act sort of not in accordance of the wishes of a tribe, what will happen? This idea that there will be punishment or excommunication. And that goes side by side with concepts of morality. And then also our relationship to chronological time started to come into play. And we could bookmark that concept and start to be thinking about, well, this ability to be in the moment began to be sort of, what would be a good word, almost became a part of neuroplasticity that might have even wired itself out of us, maybe even made it hard to kind of accommodate. One thing that's really important is that in order to simplify and to plan and to get ahead, the brain had to form categories and pretty fast judgments. And so the dilemma here may be that the very abilities that help us to evolve and to plan, to become more powerful, to colonize, may actually have a hidden cost to them. And so we could be thinking about, well, if that were true, if there was a hidden cost, would that hidden cost be able to be found inside the brain? Some of these are Bo-isms. They're some of the play that I do. So if you'll indulge me to play a little bit in the field of our neural pathways, we could say that this hidden cost center is this area around the midline of the prefrontal cortex. And that area, that hidden cost center, is called the default mode network of the brain. And that was discovered in around 2001. And is now pretty accepted. So the idea is that even when we're not thinking about anything or performing a task, especially when we're not focused, this area of the brain is extremely active. And the default mode network, right along this midline, defaults to a certain state of awareness in which we're ruminating over past events, kind of thinking about things that have happened to us that are unpleasant. We might be rehearsing for the future. And you can be thinking about this idea of chronological time here, not being in the present anymore. And then evaluating the self in negative ways, judging the body, judging the self, and then having a very intense focus on me. In Buddhism, there are so many wonderful concepts that actually refer to the default mode as the cause of our suffering. But we can also think about how the Buddha has said very famously, nothing is to be clung to as I, me, or mine. But that's what this default mode network does. It really protects its own interests. It's the colonialist part of our brain. It also constructs a lot of narratives, like she said this to me, I can't believe she did that, can you believe that? That's just an outrage. And then it seeks for confirmation of those narratives. And in order to conserve energy, it does that pretty quickly. And then often it adds another layer of meaning on top of our experience. Well, that person rejected me, I can't believe he did that. Therefore, that means it's not my destiny to be loved, or no one will ever really care about me. The world is not a loving place. And then often it relates things that happen now to things that have happened in the past. Oh, this is just like the time when my mom criticized me, or, you know, my first boyfriend left me, or whatever it is that we might be relating it to. What becomes interesting is that in certain forms of trauma, there's a pairing of what's happening in the present with memories from the past in response to physical sensation. And so there's a kind of, when things get paired in that way, a neural pathway is formed, and this default mode network is extremely active in anxiety, in depression, in chronic pain, in Alzheimer's, and in addictions. Default mode also makes this huge distinction between self and others, and really judges the self. So I'm going to take a moment just to reflect on default mode. We all have default mode, even if it sort of seems like we shouldn't. I'm going to stop the screen share for a moment. And I think it'd be really fun to kind of go heading into our chat window. And you can think of a belief that you've had recently, or something that has made you outraged, righteous indignation about the way things should be. Feel free to type it into the chat window. I see some nice questions that are popping up in there. I see we're looking at the cat. Hopefully we caught up to where we are. So again, sort of conceptualizing here, can you access a time in the recent past where you felt a sense of default mode, a proliferation of thoughts about what is fair, what's not fair? If you want to enter that in the chat window, you can. Something that has provoked perhaps a sense of great outrage, or judgment about other, like what someone has done, or judgment about the self. Current events involving Trump from Marianne, that's a really a common one, but it could be on either side, right? And one thing that we notice politically in America is that there's a strong amount of righteous indignation, of default mode activity happening from one side to the other, very little sense of unity. And it's this idea of which culture is dominant in any given moment, and which culture, and I think in many ways what we're seeing is the result of one culture sort of dominating another, one viewpoint dominating another. Ooh, and yep, Katie is mentioning, I noticed that my narrative storytelling is an addictive sensation. The body kind of revs up when we do it. And so it's really tempting to to stay in that narrative mode. Okay, let's go back into screen share. One of the things, let me read one that popped in. A homeless man in the local community. Why is he not being taken care of? What's up with that? Many people are saying, let's see, things are popping in. Why is he not taken care of by the community? And then finding out they've been trying to, and he doesn't want to work. So righteous indignation flowing from one side to the other, depending on the story, and maybe even depending on the moment in the story. So I love that one. It becomes very sort of compelling to us and very sticky. Here's one from Allison: dating and wondering what the other person thinks, whether the relationship is becoming established and solidified with trust. I think those are all ones that we can deeply resonate with ourselves. So what we can start to think about is that the default mode becomes active very often, judging anything that it defines as other. And if we can get this to work, we will share, oops, I'm gonna go down, see if we can catch up with where we were. There we are. There we go. So this is a really well-known study that was done in the arena of mindfulness. I'm just gonna make another request. If you're just logging in now, if you could mute your volume on the lower left-hand side of the screen. So in this study, and what's kind of cool about this, it's a very modern study using technology. And this is the title that was given the study: a wandering mind, we can think default mode, is an unhappy mind. It was designed to get at the question of, does mind wandering or does default mode cause suffering, or is it a side effect of suffering? That's an important research question. And they took 2,250 adults, a pretty large sample size, at the mean age of 34, and gave them an iPhone app and interrupted them throughout their day. And they would ask them questions. It would, what are you thinking about? What are you feeling right now? How are you feeling? And what are you doing? And then, are you thinking about something other than what you're doing? And that means, are you absorbed in the moment, or do you have a lot of default mode going on? And what they found is that people's minds more often wandered to things that were pleasant. And when we think about positive visualization, which has been used with athletes and with people to improve performance, you might think, well, then that's a good thing if our minds are imagining something pleasant. They found that this had no influence on mood or well-being. It's kind of important. It's also, this is an insight that I think flies in the face of that kind of world of positive thinking, of positive visualization, which we have really accepted for a long time to be effective. And they found, in short, that mind wandering, that default mode activity, is the cause of unhappiness and not a consequence of unhappiness. Their conclusion I find quite beautiful, which is the ability to think about what is not happening in the moment is a cognitive achievement that comes at an emotional cost. As a person who's very devoted to mindfulness of the body, I often think about this question as sort of also altogether leaving out the fact that we're not in our bodies when we're thinking about what's not happening in the moment. And we'll, I think we'll be able to send you a recording of this, but this study was done by Killingsworth and Gilbert in 2012. This is Mathieu Ricard, a very well-known experienced meditator and dear friend of the Dalai Lama, on whom a lot of these initial studies of monks were done. Mathieu Ricard participated in a study that looked at how sticky is the default mode, and is default mode activity, this kind of always thinking about something else, always judging others and the self, is that something that you stop doing when you get really good at present moment awareness or mindfulness? So they call this stickiness. How easy is it to get out of? And so experienced meditators were found to be people with over 2,500 hours of meditation experience. And what they found is that every 5 to 7 seconds, even experienced meditators also slip into default mode activity. But the key difference between them and us is that they're able to pay attention, to catch themselves doing it, to switch attention away from default mode and return to present moment awareness. When they looked at the brains of experienced meditators, they also found in general less connectivity, less wiring of the default mode to attention and other areas of the brain, and an increased relationship between the attention centers, I love this one, and the insula, which is the primary area of interoceptive awareness, that mindfulness in the body. So paying attention to mindfulness in the body increases with the number of hours of meditation, because we're not simply in our heads when we're meditating. That was Wendy Hasenkamp in 2012. So there's this very beautiful, in yoga we have the sutras, in Buddhist philosophy there are the suttas. Pali is very close to Sanskrit. This is the Salata Sutta, or the Arrow Sutta, from the Pali Canon. And the story that many of you may have heard is the first and second arrow, in which the first arrow is the arrow that life shoots at us. It's the unfortunate incident. We have a business that fails, or a relationship ends, or we lose a loved one, or something we wanted we don't get, or we get something, an illness that we don't want. There's a change in the body. And that's the first arrow. And the Buddha acknowledged that that first arrow is pain. It's very painful. And that none of us really escape that arrow. Difficult things will happen to us. But the second arrow is the arrow that we shoot at ourselves. And that arrow is the default mode, the stories we tell about that suffering or that pain. It's the meaning we make of it, what we decide it means about us and about others, about the world, about diversity, about experiences that are unexpected, that we start to perceive them as the stressor, as something to be removed. And the Buddha's point in that beautiful sutta is that the second arrow is preventable. The first one, that the things that happen in life are unavoidable. But the arrow we shoot at ourselves is very much preventable. So that default mode, in Buddhist philosophy, of course, default mode was not discovered. That's a very recent discovery. But they have this term called papancha, which is fun to say. I like to say it a lot. And papancha means to spread out or proliferate. And a lot of you have noticed, and you're pointing out in the chat window, that as soon as we start to go into this narrative and this story, it embellishes itself and it adds on and it kind of grows and it kind of spreads, and then it sort of starts connecting to our attention centers. Now, have you ever noticed that when someone does something outrageous and you start to tell others about it, it becomes sticky and it starts occupying your attention, and it's hard to turn away. It becomes an obsession or even an obstacle or an impediment. It grows, it colonizes our mind, our thoughts, and our brain, and until we're really in it, we're really suffering. And this sutta is from the Dhammapada of Buddhism, papancha biratapaja, nipapancha tathagata. And it's not important to know the Pali terminology, but you'll find lots of translations of 254, but I love this one. People are smitten with proliferation, and they call it fetters, but also the term objectification, this objectifying self, objectifying others. And the Tathagata, where freedom is non-proliferation, is recognizing default mode. And as these monks and experienced meditators do, returning attention, pulling it out of that default mode that has colonized and exploited our attention, and bringing it back to the present. I'm taking just a moment here. And so this is one of the themes of today. One of my favorite authors, David Foster Wallace, who wrote, and actually this came from a commencement address that he gave at Kenyon College in 2005, and called "This is Water," and you can find it online for free. We'll send out a link to you. And he writes, "Learning how to think really means learning how to exercise some control over what and how you think. It means being conscious and aware enough to choose what you pay attention to and how you construct meaning from experience." So there he is, really talking about that default mode narrative and that extra layer of meaning. And he says, because if you cannot exercise this kind of choice in your adult life, you will be totally hosed. And totally hosed means kind of out of luck, for anyone for whom that phrase isn't recognizable. So I wanted to take another moment to call to mind a situation in which you've had a papancha, a kind of proliferation that's occupying your thoughts, and also causing that very quick trigger evaluation of experience or others, any kind of diversity, as stress. And that's what happens. Anything that doesn't resemble the way we perceive experience gets experienced as a stressor. Just a moment to check in with that, and also to kind of begin to hold space for how do we become present? How do we become present with the body's experience of that? Like what gets evoked in the body in response to this kind of proliferation that takes over our attention. And so we'll just allow a few rounds of breath to check in with that. And you can certainly begin to note any kind of narrative that seems super present as you're doing this. And we'll take just a little bit more time and then maybe open up to some Q&A before we end. But to talk about, all right, we're getting into this idea of how is this relevant to yoga, to biodiversity, and to the sort of deepening of the human species rather than the forward evolution, which is what default mode network is invested in. And we start to look at that this is not just a cultural issue and a neural one, but it's also behavioral. And one of the cool resources I've been reading lately in the field of technology, and in particular ethical technology, if you've not heard that term, it's kind of cool to be thinking about that there's a whole sort of class of, what am I thinking of occupation that's devoted to ethical technologists, thinking about how our social media and technology environment is actually growing our brains, is affecting our connectivity. And so this is Tristan Harris. He wrote this amazing article called Time Well Spent. And he talks about the nuclear arms race of attention. You got to get it. You got to get more attention. And the social media technology equations or menus that are being created, and not simply in part of Facebook, but in the entire technological marketplace, is designed to get us to react, to cultivate outrage, and to get us to move away from rather than move toward, and curating our outrage. And also, when we curate outrage, we're really wiring in this default mode that causes us to kind of evaluate others in relation to kind of a diversity of ideas, becomes stressful. We start to feel like we can I'm going to turn this into a verb, but other people, to make them into other or into foreigners, to create dominant cultures where we don't really allow people to express their own diversity. In this kind of, Tristan calls this persuasive technology, this connective tissue of the brain thing, where we have the ability to do things to people's minds that they themselves don't even notice, don't even see is happening. You bend people's reality, he says, as you go along, so that they become very outraged, very non-embracing of diversity without really realizing it. So in little progressive increments. What's really important is that we also know that neuroplasticity, the way we change our brains, but also bioplasticity, we change our bodies through kind of subtle practices that are practiced over a long period of time. And so our tech environment, social media environment, has recognized this and uses this to build a culture of outrage, a culture of colonialism, and a pretty sectarian culture where we begin to have an easier time demonizing others or any expression of diversity in relation to our own default settings. And he says technology hijacks our minds, but we know that it also hijacks our bodies. It's a culture of convenience, technology is. But it's not about saving time and making things quicker. It's actually about saving movement or saving evolution, making ourselves stay in one spot. And so we live in a culture that's sedentary and becoming sort of, when we think about sedentarianism, we think about not moving as much. But it's also a culture that's not growing in the diversity of ideas, in accommodating people that are different, experiences that are different than the ones that we expect. Everything is adapted to our needs, and the goal becomes total comfort and ease, right? And so I've noticed over the last several years, even in teacher training, where we have a group of people that are, we would think are more evolved. This sort of culture of a lack of diversity, a colonialist approach to power over versus, power among or empoweredness, where we expect comfort and we expect to be mirrored a lot of the time in yoga. And this is something I feel that's being inculcated into us over a long period of time. And the idea of mindfulness, of being able to tolerate a diverse group of ideas and experiences and people is almost an endangered species of experience. It's in danger of becoming extinct. So we can look at how does this kind of travel with us. And then without this idea of movement, expansion, hydration, biodiversity, the individual and the system together begin to wither and stagnate. And I would call this failure to thrive. And this brings us back to discomfort, where stress becomes anything that's not like us, any person that's a different color or a different ideological system. Stress becomes anything that's diverse or different than what we wanted, the menu that we planned for ourselves. We don't easily tolerate diversity in other people, in other situations, and even in ideas. Almost any new big change in ideas is often met with persecution in a dominant culture. So this becomes a recipe for stress reduction. I want someone to remove the stressors so I feel more comfortable. I want to change the behavior of other people. I want you to change my environment. This is what you're supposed to do. I want to avoid discomfort, avoid disappointment of any kind, and only show me ideas in the likeness of my ideas, only show me people that resemble me, and experiences that resemble a really narrow menu of experience that I've learned to accommodate. And that becomes this request to be mirrored all the time, to only see things in the likeness of what our default mode has defined as self. But this is a huge stress reduction model. It's not really a resilience model. A resilience is like intimately connected to this idea of biodiversity. And what we could say that we're doing is creating a kind of very fragile, dominant culture nervous system in which our nervous systems don't have diversity. And in fact, in order to grow, our nervous systems really do need diversity of ideas, diversity of experiences, and also a diversity of people, being among people who think differently than we do. And I know I'm moving a little fast, but I want to open it up in just a moment to questions. But we approach our gut microbiome the same way. We have an illness. It's thought to be caused by bad bacteria. And so we've gotten used to taking an antibiotic to wipe out the bad bacteria. But really what it does is it wipes out the diversity of the gut microbiome. It wipes out sort of all bacteria. And it's really important to acknowledge that we're now starting to actually add probiotics into diet to kind of bring back in that diversity. And even looking at things like the variability in time between heartbeats is also an important expression of diversity. We don't want an evenly beating heart. That's the stress reduction model. Research shows that you can't think yourself out of the default mode using your mind. That's like adding default mode onto default mode. So what helps is cultivating mindfulness, also being absorbed in a task, and then mindfulness of the body, which is also known as interoception. And so I wanted to throw out this idea as we come to a close that inner fitness is the capacity to have moment-to-moment awareness of the body, and to also be aware of how and what we think, as David Foster Wallace said. And also to have the ability to switch our attention back and forth between the two. So mindfulness isn't only in the mind or isn't only in the body. And in fact, when you look at mindfulness, the Satipatthana Sutra, which is one of the foundational texts, actually does say that mindfulness starts with the body. And so what this means is that we want to be paying attention on purpose and without judgment to what's happening in the present moment inside the body. So it's not simply breathing, for example, but being aware of the sensation of the breath as it comes in and out through the nose, or in and out through the chest or through the abdomen. The scientific term is called interoception, which is an emerging area in neuroscience and brain research, as well as connective tissue research. And it's really talking about when our default mode is uncomfortable, when it's in a place of outrage. The way to that diversity of experience and resilience is our ability to receive and read and respond to these momentary signals of the body. And embodiment's not just these discrete moments that we can guide ourselves in a body-based meditation, but the sustained mindfulness of the body, the capacity to be in our bodies when the stakes are high, when it's really difficult, or we're in pain, or fear, or self-loathing, or outrage, or papancha of any kind, and when we would much rather be in our heads or anywhere else instead. And this embodiment over time becomes, and this beautiful Hebrew word, I'm going to credit this to Krista Tippett, in her On Being podcast, nefesh, which is the Hebrew term for the consciousness that animates the body. The body's not just inanimate matter, but has a consciousness to it. So we can think about this idea of visceral resilience or interoception or embodiment as that it's not just all about strength or awe-inspiring flexibility or endurance or even agility, but it's about our resilience and the capacity to kind of adapt to and tolerate and respond to what the environment gives us, that first arrow, rather than what we expect to encounter. And that really promotes what I would call the biodiversity of lived experience. That's our kind of, if you can see that, that's our resilience model. So I'm going to stop for just a moment there. I'm going to stop screen share and just take a moment to check in with everyone. And let me see how much, because I don't think, have a whole lot left to go. And it might be nice to kind of open the discussion to a series of questions before we come to a close. And one study question to kind of float out to all of you is, when you're in this place of papancha, where you're wanting something from your environment or from another person and they're not offering it, one study question is my indignation or outrage, is it a response to diversity, like to the diversity of an experience or opinion or person that I didn't expect to encounter? And if so, instead of reacting to that expression of diversity, we might actually go into embodied practices instead. So before we end, I thought I would open it out if you want to use your chat window. And then what we might do is just kind of select a question or two. And I can even, I see one in there now. Oh, and hi, Natalie. Natalie is offering up this idea and connecting this to the impact of male domination or a male dominating culture and the consumerism on body image in teen girls and older women. And that's absolutely true. And we can even think about how we colonize or colonialize the body in terms of race as well, the racialized body, the body that doesn't fit a certain mold, the ability to or the sort of need to shape and sculpt the body and make it look different. And the fact that all of these are part of colonialism, this way of approaching the body as not a part of us, right? The way we approach it, diversity of ideas and diversity of experience, that's not a part of me. It's not a part of my MO or my menu. Marianne writes, if the mind more often wanders to pleasant thoughts, how then is the wandering mind the cause of unhappiness? Is it that default mode takes over? And is that different from the free-flowing wandering mind? I think what that question is getting at, and I love this question, is that are we supposed to now understand the default mode as all negative? Like we should never have our minds wander. And that's a question where I think it naturally, beautifully invites the idea of granularity into what we're talking about. Default mode isn't all bad. And in fact, it's found to be one of the sources of creative energy. But the question is, does it have us by the jugular, or are we able to pull attention away from default mode when we need to? So that's what I would say to that. Isn't default mode, from Emma, also part of survival? It's absolutely, so again, our default mode, we want to not simply say, oh, it's like all bad, so we never want to do it. That prefrontal cortex is part of evolution. I know this is a little intricate for what we're looking at today, but evolutionary biologists and scientists talk about default mode as the sort of evolutionary adaptation to living, this idea of survival of the fittest. And to do that, to survive and adapt, we might need to make these very short, quick decisions about what's me and what's not me. However, what I find to be interesting is if you dig a little deeper, a little underneath that, you find out that every evolutionary adaptation also requires a counter adaptation. You could think of that as a counter pose if you are a yogi. And it just so happens that the adaptation to the adaptation of default mode is interoceptive awareness, or mindfulness of the body. I am not making that up. That's actually in the literature if you dig underneath. So yes, survival, but also we start to look at, are we really surviving as a species? And is default mode, which originally evolved to help us get ahead, again, that hidden cost, that we are now a culture of individuals, that we have the least amount of diversity than at any time in history, and that we are very strongly still continuing to have issues around diversity in our political structures, the way people of different races, ethnicities, body types, sexual orientations, ethnic orientations. For example, in the Baha'i tradition in Iran, Baha'is are persecuted now for practicing their faith or for getting an education, which is a very, it's not something I think many people are aware of, and it's a very sort of serious indicator that we are in a difficult moment in our culture. Let me take another question here. From Jane. I think it seems there's quite a bit of information supporting the default mode network and a relationship with creativity. Yes? Yes. In response, yes. Again, that wandering mind is also connected to our creative spirit, but not when it's wandering to the menus of outrage or discomfort or righteous indignation or that second arrow of suffering. I'd love to take one or two verbal questions. Anyone would like to ask something, and you're welcome to, in the chat window, if you'd like to ask something, just type your name in, say, I have a question, and then we can call on you to unmute yourself. In the process, I'll see if I can find another one in here. I just see from Emma, how long before there is an evolution to interoception? If there is always evolution? Well, it's a really good question, and the question is, are we surviving as a species? Or is the lack of biodiversity and the increase, and one of the ways we know that we have that lack is an increase in natural disasters and the way that our environmental, what we think of as resources, right, are being used or depleted. I wanted to throw out in the indigenous systems of which where I originated in my life, was lucky enough to be born into, water isn't experienced as a resource, right? We think of water as a natural resource, but indigenous people say it's actually a way of life. So even the idea that water is a resource, or air is a resource, clean air, or food is a resource might be a very narrow framework for understanding what a resource is. And Emma's saying a dance of global homeostasis. Well, I mean, I think that we are at this time in our history where we can actually make choices, not simply about how we use resources, but how we respond to this idea of diversity, other ideas, other experiences. There is, the Dalai Lama is going to be having dialogues in August in Botswana with several civil rights leaders on Ubuntu philosophy, which is pronounced Ubuntu, but spelled U-B-U-N-T-U. And that way of being, that way of sort of indigenous philosophy says, I am better when you are better. I function better when you have more, and that we are in it together. So that's a kind of beautiful way of beginning to understand how we really are interconnected. I do not see questions yet in the chat window. If you do want to ask something, feel free to kind of pop in there. And in the meantime, I think I might show one or two more slides. So I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to look for, see if we can look for our, I may not share the screen just yet. Oh yeah, here it is. So we're looking for our resilience and social justice. Let's see if this will work. So now you're going to see articles in my screen, and then let's kind of scroll down to where we might want to end soon. I heard this lovely quote the other day on being, which was, the blessings that we have are to be found outside of our comfort zone. Let's see if we can get this to work. But this is, if we can make it work, yep, this is a slide showing our ConnectOMe. And the ConnectOMe, we can make a little play on words there and call it OM. This is an actual picture of where neuroscience is going. So instead of mapping the brain in terms of location, which is really reductionistic and very much a colonialist enterprise, this is sort of an ever-growing map of the ways in which pathways in the brain are linked and are connected. This is another picture of the ConnectOMe, and it looks like this sort of beautiful, like a palomino horse upside down, or you could even think of it as colored spaghetti or anything else, or a mohawk, depending on how you would think of this. But the ConnectOMe is this beautiful sort of model for our own connection, that biodiversity and being able to tolerate different ideas. And even physically, that, you know, thinking about how the body and bodily practice relates to that. So we might ask the question of ourselves, why does nature endow us with a body that is constantly changing, that is literally always unpredictable, always different from one moment to the next? We can never quite get a handle on what's happening in the body. And research on interoception actually shows that when we develop the capacity to be present with the unexpected, the biodiversity of experience inside our body, as well as with others, we develop a visceral resilience, right? The capacity to tolerate and flow with experiences that are outside what we know how to do. That not only do we live better in our bodies, but we live better with others. We're able to kind of flux and flow with others as well. And interestingly, the literature and research on interoception, on visceral resilience, shows that it transfers up to the brain. It actually does promote stress resilience and emotional resilience, which is really kind of wild. So I wanted to ask the question, what is our vision for humanity? What is our role in that vision? And how does yoga or contemplative practice or fitness come into play? This is where the wild things are. One of my favorite books of all time. I'm going to stop screen sharing, and then, I think we have a comment about the Dalai Lama looking, maybe it is the Dalai Lama from Emily, looking at everyone as brothers and sisters. I think that's completely true. So does anyone have a question or an offering or something you'd like to ask? We can also be thinking about what is our practice? And so the next time something makes us upset or we find outrage is cultivated within us, how do we then, what do we do? How can we be present with that momentary sensation in our bodies so that we're not being sort of drawn into that papancha, that proliferation? You would like to ask a question before we end, go to the bottom of your screen and you'll see a little menu there, the bottom of the Zoom screen, and you can hit chat. It's a little round dialog box, and when you hit chat, you can kind of go over into the chat field and say, I have a question, I have something I would like to say. I'm curious. Is anyone uncomfortable? Because this is not meant to be like a warm and fuzzy stress resilience seminar, but it's a call to action. It's like, how are we as yogis and contemplative practitioners, are we doing our job? So from David, I have an observation. So whichever, I know we might have more than one David, whoever typed in, I have an observation, please feel free to go to the bottom left corner of your screen where you see the volume button and unmute yourself. And you'll show up in the big screen if you do. And we're happy to hear and hold your observation.
Hi, Bo, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi. Yeah, so the observation really, well, two things, I guess. I found it really interesting when you was talking about the sort of social media and the research that had been done there. And something I read somewhere, and I don't know if you've seen this research or whether it was research as such, was the fact that we seem to be devolving the use of language by using emojis. And it's actually sort of, conversation is feedback. That conversation is actually getting harder because, people are tending to use emojis and stuff. And we're actually almost going back to sort of ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs and that kind of thing.
I love that observation. Yeah, it's, I noticed recently we had a session at the Yoga Journal conference in New York where everyone was in a group. And I think you're right on target there, David, because one thing I noticed is that people were taking a lot of individual time in their own dialogue. We're completely missing the social cues from the people around and on either side of them that were sort of like, people were literally drawing the cutoff signs on their own net or moving away from or trying to set verbal limits on one another, and nothing was registering. So I think not only the ability to express emotions, but to read others' bodies, the prosody, which is a word that Stephen Porges uses to talk about inflections in vocal tone. You are right, David. I think we're really losing a lot of that. And therefore, I think that sort of detracts from our capacity to embrace that biodiversity, to sort of evolve together, for sure. And I love that I love your accent, and I love the awareness that we are a global community, really having this dialogue together.
Thanks.
Did you have a, yeah, was there
second thing was, I guess, the observation maybe sort of MBSR shouldn't be mindfulness-based stress reduction. It should be mindfulness-based stress resilience.
Oh, yep. I was wondering when someone was going to pick up on that. I think that mindfulness-based stress reduction was an absolutely brilliant term, and it's really touching to hear John Kabat-Zinn talk about how he developed that. And at the time he developed that, it was a very useful concept for people. And it was, everyone wants stress reduction, right? And that was the prevailing thinking, like lower stress in order for us to be healthier. I think it was the perfect container or vessel to evolve mindfulness in a very secular world. And yet we could, David, we could say, like, maybe we could start to think of it as mindfulness-based stress resilience, and how to bring back mindful awareness of the body so that mindfulness is less cerebral, perhaps today. And John's early writing and work really did emphasize that a lot. So thank you.
And I look forward to meeting you in London as well.
Yeah, me as well. That's less than 2 weeks away.
Yeah.
We have a comment from Emily saying the vision of humanity as brothers and sisters could be the soil for biodiversity. I love it. And then the difficult part is, what do we do the next time we go to wherever we go to buy groceries and the line is longer than we think it should be? And we're extremely annoyed. Or the person bagging our groceries, which by the way is an American thing, doesn't really, if you expect your groceries to be bagged in another country, they'll look at you like you are from another planet. But like someone bags your groceries the wrong way, or you're in a group of people and someone responds in a way that's a pain in the tail. Like all these things happen. Anyone else with a question or observation that you'd like to offer before we end today? We're totally open. It's a lot to take in, right? But completely open to kind of hearing reflections and thoughts on your vision for humanity. I thought I would also talk about this concept of when you're in papancha, very often there's the desire to be right or to get other people onto our side. And so one of our study questions is, again, to emphasize, is my outrage, is my indignation a response to encountering something that's diverse, a different idea, a different opinion, a different way of being? And then how do I ask beautiful questions? And a beautiful question might be like, what's getting stirred up in my body in this moment in time? Almost everyone can probably imagine a time when they felt really pissed off in recent time because something hasn't gone the way we've wanted it to. And instead of sort of utilizing one another to create a dominant culture belief, like, oh, can you believe she did that? Yeah, I know, right? Like that is so awful. To really be utilizing other people's input to be saying, wait, what made me so uncomfortable about this? And what does that feel like in the body? Can I allow myself a little time to go in and perceive that? Last call for reflections, questions, opportunities. We'd also love to kind of give some thought to, I think, again, we're really unprepared to have such a large response to this. And we might even send you a small survey to kind of figure out what need do people have? How do we do more of these and offer them for free? What would be the format, if they're useful to people, how they might be useful. I think one of the things that we might have learned today is that every time someone logs in, we do hear that sound. But I also do love the fact that we can see each other also if we want to. Okay, I'm looking in the window, and I see from a yoga teacher's perspective, this is quite a responsibility to lift this lid for students. Yeah, absolutely. And I'm going to even add a little bit of a challenge to that and say, in order to lift this for anyone else, we have to lift it for ourselves. I think it's easy to say that yoga means union, and therefore we're always on the same page, we're always together, and we're always working for love and unity. But yoga is no less vulnerable as a field to the influences of technology, colonialism, this idea of forward progress, the commodification of the body. And so how do we become aware that yoga also isn't inherently union, but it may also at times reflect this dominant culture perspective and a lack of biodiversity and a competition among yogis, and that's present too. And so what's our own part in resolving that? How do we respond when we see different ideas? Or even people working together that we wouldn't expect work together. I recently did a workshop with a colleague in New York, and I got letters and all kinds of comments from people saying, like, this is not who you are. You're, cheapening the profession of yoga. So I think there's something that gets stirred up in us in response to what we encounter. And so I also feel that colonialism also looks at the teacher as the teacher and the students as the students. And there's always this kind of a hierarchy there. And we really, I don't see that division necessarily. I recognize that it's a different way of looking at things, but we have to be also in process with these practices ourselves in order to have a hope of pulling the lid off for anyone else. I see a question. David, do you want to ask your question? David F. You're welcome to unmute yourself and then ask it. We love hearing different voices. Do you want to, or would you prefer that I do it?
I'm trying.
There you go.
There you go. So if I can't do the 2,500 hours of meditation, if I'm not there yet,
yeah,
how do I more easily and frequently catch myself when I'm triggered or stuck and be able to switch back and forth?
Yeah, excellent.
Got any suggestions?
Yes. The first thing I'd say is that although the study did look at experienced meditators, I do want to highlight some other work that I've seen recently, which shows that even beginning meditators can have more body awareness than either dancers or long-term meditators. So what that kind of does is it levels the playing field, and it makes it a lot more sort of, what would be the term? We're better able to understand this not just as an advanced practice, but something that we also can do. And so the first step is to recognize when we're immersed in outrage, right, or in discomfort, and to really sort of map out that territory for ourselves. What does it feel like? Do you have a sense of what it's like when you have that sense of incredible outrage at something, the proliferation of a sort of, I'm so pissed off at this person. And then what does it feel like in the body? Do you know when that's happening?
I do.
You do. So then the key is, and I think I'm going to mute you for just a moment, and I'm going to mute all. I'm getting a little conversational background. So the key thing is to simply do what we did earlier. We had a little check-in. We brought our hands onto our body, and we asked the question, am I in my body in this moment? What sensations am I noticing? And when we have papancha, when the default mode is going, often there's a gripping in the abdomen. There's a kind of shortness of breath or a clenching of the muscles, our organs of perception, the jaw, the eyes become really intense. And we might think, oh, we should just create relaxation in the body then. And in fact, all we want to do is cultivate momentary awareness of the sensations we're having in the body as we're in papancha. So you might remember the definition of inner fitness is the capacity to be aware of what and how we think, like when is default mode really exploding, that second arrow, when we shoot ourselves, and then the capacity to cultivate awareness of bodily sensation and the ability to switch back to bodily sensation when we're in a place of outrage. Does that help? And anyone can do that.
And so a follow-up I've had, so I have a friend and I can see when she's in default mode, and that seems to put me in default mode.
Oh yeah.
And by what I'm referring to there is I would want to plan something so I can kind of get my schedule set, but she wants to be more spontaneous, present in the moment. But that's why we don't get together, because the activity might be good, where we're going to go is good, but somebody, like I already have something committed. So, you know, and I go like, well, hey, let's do it tomorrow. And she's like, nah, we'll see what happens tomorrow. But then tomorrow she'll forget about it, you know? So then that'll get me in my default mode.
Yeah. So each of you is saying, I don't really want biodiversity. One of you wants spontaneity pretty much all the time. The other one wants to plan pretty much all the time. And so one thing that you might simply do is to say, okay, at the prospect of spontaneity, what kind of papancha gets activated? What story am I telling? And can I go into my body? There's something about spontaneity that really gets me going. What can I observe in my body when that's happening? Because we don't change others, but we want to increase the diversity that we're able to experience. Our sort of menu, right? The variety on our own menu. And for you, that might be starting to notice what happens when spontaneity is on the table.
Okay.
And to keep going into the bodily sensations there, which could be, well, I guess I don't even want to say what I think they could be, because you'll have your own flavor of that experience. And you might choose to still not be spontaneous, but if you're doing the work of saying, okay, where is that living in my body, that sense of resistance to spontaneity, what's getting evoked, where is it living? And then we're not trying to change it or make it go away when we're doing interoception, just to be able to be with it.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
That helps.
And Katie offered, oh, thank you, David. So Katie offered in the chat window, I'm constantly desiring the good experiences and not allowing the quote unquote bad to be felt. And this can be related to diversity of people and experience and the expectation of things or people to be a certain way so that I can experience the good and never the bad. That's brilliant. I think, we can see so many things about that in yogic and Buddhist philosophy, not being attached either to pleasure or to pain, or being averse to pleasure or to pain. I love that, Katie. I think that is a diversity experience for sure. Speaking of diversity, we've had 2 questions from men, which is highly unusual, and they've both been named David. So do we want to take at least one question from a woman? If there's anyone else named David that wants to ask anything, I'm totally open though as well. So maybe 1 or 2 more questions in the chat window before we sign off together. Anyone have anything?
Hey, I've got one.
Okay.
Is there another guy not named David in the call? Let's get him in there.
Oh, well, you mean you want 3 people? I see.
I'm just thinking of being spontaneous and going for another guy.
You want another guy?
Yeah.
Well, yeah, we want to make it totally voluntary. I see 2 or 3 Ds, so I can't really see full names. That's just the way that Zoom does. I know that there have been 2 Davids so far. So we could say a David could ask a question, or we could move on to a woman or someone else. That's the cool thing about spontaneity. You never know who's going to ask. Alejandra, how are you? Do you want to ask your question in person? You can unmute yourself in the lower left. My question is a question about questions. I love that.
Yeah. Hey, hi, Bo.
Hi.
I guess it usually takes me, as you know, a while to process just generally sensations, information.
Yeah.
So in terms of having thoughts spill over throughout the day, is there a way of getting them to you or to the group?
You mean to sort of let things cook and simmer and then have questions in the future?
Yes.
That is such a good question. Yes, I think there is. We have not, as you can tell, I don't think we anticipated a large response, and we're trying to think about what's the best way to host it and the best way to have a forum for questions. So the short answer is yes, we would really like to, if you guys are finding this to be a helpful enterprise to start to talk about some of these things that are related to embodiment. The question about how to do that, I spent a couple hours talking to Zoom yesterday, and it may not be through them, it may be through some other means. So yes, and bear with us. We'll try to make that happen. And then we have another one that I can, they're starting to pop in. Wait, they're going a little fast now. Oh, they're fast. I'm gonna take one more. Let's see. Oh, but so you guys were shy for a moment there, and now they're coming in fast. So let's see. So Alejandra, we'll find a way of keeping you guys posted. We do have the list. Yeah. Okay, I'm scrolling through here. Okay. I have one from, it looks like Laya, but it's all one word. So I'm not sure if I'm reading that correctly. You want to unmute and you might be our last question? Unless you're not still on anymore. Let me, while we're waiting, I'll read. I love the idea of seeking discomfort as a way to build resilience, and the edges of our comfort zones are the spaces where we learn from our experience instead of storing them. I love that. I appreciate the idea that building internal awareness could also be a building block to building external awareness and connectivity by shutting down expectations and allowing experiences in the moment. Beautiful, and thank you for the webinar. All right, I think this might be a signing off time. I wanted to turn it over to Katie and Catherine. One thing we thought we would do is sort of celebrate this by saying to you that we will get back to you about our next big webinar, and then also offer everyone a coupon for our online course, and we'll figure out a way to send you either the audio recording or the whole thing as well. We're not sure yet how we're doing that. We thought we'd have like 20 people along with us. So Catherine and Katie, do you want anything to add before we sign off all the way?
Hi, everyone. So Catherine actually has had to go, so I'll take over here. But I did want to thank everyone for signing on with this, and like Bo said, we'll be following up with you. If you could just shoot me an email saying that you attended, just so we have an idea of who attended the meeting. That way we have a list. Bo, I don't know if you can keep track of everyone that's logged in, but just so that we can reach out to you and get you that coupon for everyone that